All right, so tonight I was going to talk a little bit about GraphQL with Python. And there's the slides if you want to get some of the links that's in the presentation. It's bit.ly/py-GraphQL. All right, so let me start off first. What is GraphQL? So I have the official definition there from the website. GraphQL is a query language for APIs and a runtime for fulfilling those queries with existing data. GraphQL provides a complete and understandable description of the data in your API. So that's kind of the official definition. But if you want to kind of think of this a little bit more simple, a lot of you have probably written REST APIs, and GraphQL provides us a way to write these APIs in a different way that hopefully will give us some benefits that we'll talk about here. So, like I said, it's just really a different way to write APIs now. Basically, instead of like writing a REST API, you just describe your data, and then you describe the interactions with your data, and then an API is generated for you from those descriptions. So instead of worrying about different URLs and endpoints, you can kind of eliminate some of that back and forth. So the goal of GraphQL basically is to reduce development bandwidth. Another goal of it is to reduce your bandwidth in terms of amount of data that's sent back and forth. So instead of just always having to accept what the API is going to give you, you can actually now you can control what you're asking for and what comes back. So hopefully speed up some of your API calls. And then another thing that it does is you can now also bundle a bunch of API calls into one request, so you're not making multiple calls. So again, another speed up in terms of your application. This isn't really like a new idea. Let's go to the site here. I guess to go back a step backwards here. GraphQL was created by Facebook, and they basically open sourced it maybe like 2 years ago, I think. And like I said, it's not really a new idea. There's an alternative called Falcor, and that's by Netflix. Kind of works differently, but same idea. And also, I believe, I couldn't really find the docs for the Google implementation, but Google has an implementation where if you ever use like the Google Drive API, you just download a document when you're using it, and then that document tells your API or your JavaScript everything that you can do. So Google, I think, has some sort of implementation of this too. There's a thing called gRPC. I couldn't figure out though necessarily if that's what they were using for Google Drive, but similar technology. They're kind of implemented differently. I guess the real good thing about GraphQL compared to like Falcor, they kind of just did it in JavaScript, and it hasn't really grown past that. Where GraphQL, they made it more of sort of like a protocol. So there's other implementations of GraphQL. So even though most of the tools that started GraphQL are all in JavaScript, there's other implementations now in Python, in Go, in PHP that have started. So we can use the same technology, and actually you can now, if you have a GraphQL backend, you can interface, with different front ends and back ends, and it doesn't really matter which language you're using. All right, so let's think about our typical development cycle. And if anyone's been on like a team where you have like a separate front end and back end team, a lot of times this is what happens. And maybe if you're just doing the full stack, a lot of times this is what maybe happens between yourself, right? You have a back end, right? You write your back end API, okay, and you think, okay, try to think a little bit up front. Okay, I'm going to need these fields. I'm going to need this data. So this is what I'm going to write. You develop your API, and now you go to write your front end. And you go to use the API, and you find out, well, I guess I didn't write everything into my API in the back end that I needed. So I'm going to have to go tweak that now. And so then you toss that back over to the back end team, maybe issue some requirements that they go do. They modify the API, everyone's happy now. You got your changes in, but now the project is further along, and so your requirements have changed, and so now you need your API to do something different. So once again, you call your backend team, and they go make some updates. And so a lot of times with a normal API, you'll have like this back and forth of front end and back end development changes. Like I said, if you have a front end and back end team, you almost always see this. If you're full stack, you're probably doing this yourself. 1 hour you're working on the front end, 1 hour you're working on the back end. So the promise with GraphQL is that we'll get a better development lifecycle here. So instead, with GraphQL, we hopefully reduce some of our steps. We develop our API. It's done. The front end now has a choice of what they can do with that API. Hopefully you've included all the fields that they need. They can pick whether or not to use those fields. Now you may eventually need some changes. So again, you might have to change your API in the future. But because the front end can now decide what data they want to use, there's less of that back and forth. And like I said, GraphQL is implemented in multiple languages now. So what I'll be showing off tonight is called Graphene. So this is the Python implementation of GraphQL. And if we go into the docs here, you can basically use it with any kind of Python web framework that you would like. So if you wanted to use it with Flask, you could use it with Flask. If you want to use it with Django, you can use it with Django. There's a couple implementations you can see at the bottom that have already been built. So like if you use it with Django, it's actually really easy to use. But you can see there's an SQL Alchemy plugin. Ideally, you want to plug it into your ORM, and then you can just generate your API off of your database models. You can see there's also a Graphene for Google App Engine. But like I said, you don't necessarily have to use those integrations. You can use Flask or any other kind of lightweight Python web framework if you want to. I'm going to show off basically using it on top of Django with a database, but I've also talked with other companies that they actually use it for like, maybe you don't have a database, maybe you're just putting it on top of like other APIs. So you kind of have like a GraphQL layer that talks to other APIs. And then, you could maybe write that in Python or JavaScript, and then everyone uses this GraphQL API to talk to these other APIs. So that's another kind of way of doing it. All right. So, like I said, I'm going to actually give a little example here. I won't try to convert everyone tonight, but I'm going to get your phone numbers and addresses. So I actually wrote a little Bible app. My dad was like reading one day, and all the like Bible apps have like ads, and he was like, "Why is there a pole dancer in my Bible app?" So I thought there must be a better way. So I wrote this little Bible app for him, and I implemented it in GraphQL. So this is the example I'm going to show off tonight. So I'm not going to go into my models, but if you think of a typical book here, the way I have my models set up is I have a book, and then I have a verse, and then so that's in my database, all that data. This is what the Django GraphQL looks like. So all I do now to create my API is I say, okay, I want to create an API for the book. These are the fields that I'm going to allow for searching and filtering. And then I'm actually allowing just all my fields. You can actually, if there's some fields you want to protect and not put in your API, you could put that also. And then you can see I'm also making a class for my verse model. So I have all my verses in my database. And that's it. Now all I do to hook up my API is I just use this little query class. And basically I've defined what data I want to expose via an API. And now I hook this up to a URL, and I have a GraphQL API. It's really not hard at all. So let's see this in action now. So I'm going to show it off for my little data app here. Let's see. So the cool thing with GraphQL now is I have this API. It automatically gets documented. So let me make this a little bit bigger. So this is my API docs. This is a little tool that lets you interact with your API and kind of create some queries that you would do with your data. And all this, I didn't write any of these docs. This comes from that one little definition file now that I've created. So I have a query. You can see this is all of the data that's available. So, if I wanted to query a verse, this is all the different fields that come with that verse now. And, if I go back, you can see there's the book model. So there's stuff that I can query and get back on the book. So now as a front-end developer, I can come in here and play around with the API and see what kind of data is available. So let me come in here. And just to kind of limit my request here, and so this is a little syntax you'll have to learn. You get what's called an edge and a node. But once you get into the edge and the node, I can now request different data. And you can see it's all auto-completed for me. And let me put an ID in here now. So now as a front-end developer, I can explore all of the data that's available in my API, come up with a query. These are the fields that I just want. I don't have to have an API tell me which fields are coming back. I pick which fields I want, and here we go. I get my query, and there we go. There's all of the data that comes back. So now one day, say, this is really too much data. I don't really need the ID anymore. Okay, I don't need that back. I saved myself a couple bytes, so my app is even faster now. Now let's say I've decided that a book has verses associated with it. So I'm going to limit this a little bit more. I can now make a subquery. So because a verse is associated with a book, I can make a join in our database, get some data from that. So again, put this edges and node in. And now I can select fields that I want from that. Let me do, I think, this, and then I'll do the text. So now I've automatically kind of done a join back into the database, and I can hit query. And this will take a little bit longer. Hopefully I don't kill my database. There we go. So now I've got all the verses for that particular book. So let's go ahead and, so right now I've been limiting my query. You know, I'm just saying return to me like the first chapter or the first book. Let's go ahead and put in one of those filters that I've used. So you can remember I was allowing you to filter by a slug. So let me go ahead and say I just want one particular thing. See if I get my syntax right. I haven't used this in a while. Now I can pull one particular book and just get that. You can do it. All right, so there we go. So that's a demo of my API. There are actually other APIs out there. GitHub is probably the biggest one, where they've put their API and their data out via GraphQL. So now instead of having to know like what all the different endpoints are, you can get all their data through one endpoint and just request what you want from it. So this is the GitHub API. Let's play with that a little bit. And yeah, this is a previous query I put in. And I can run this. And now I can query, go through commits, repositories, anything I want to. I can pull it all out at once in one request. Same thing, let me show that off too. So right here, I was kind of doing a join, right, in the database. Let's say I want to do 2 queries at once. I'm going to get the same information here. I guess I had an error in my syntax. Did I get that all correct? Let me take out the 1. See if that works. Alright, so that works. Maybe I need a comma. All right, well, let me try this out. I'll try another query out here by doing a verse query. And I'll just to show that off. So now basically I've not only done a book query, but I've also done a verse query all at the same time, all in one request. And then, you know, if you're wondering maybe about pagination, let's see. I think we want a cursor maybe? Nope. I forget how to do the pagination here. I think it's down this level. Yeah, there we go. Let's try that out. You can see now I didn't remember how to do page info, but it just kind of filled it in for me. So now if I wanted to paginate through stuff, there we go. I have a cursor now that I can paginate through my data if I need it. All this, again, right? A front-end person can now come in here, pick exactly what data they want, and just pull it out. They decide one day they don't need a piece of data, they remove it. They decide they want something else, they add it. This is another demo. Same thing. This is from GraphQL.org, but they have a little movie database. So again, I come in here, I want to look up the films. Gives me the Empire or all the Star Wars films. Let's see what else they have in here. I don't even know what the vehicle connection is. Let's see what that is. Does it have a name maybe? There we go. So again, this makes it really handy for front-end developers, right? They can come in here, they don't necessarily know the API, they have automatic docs, they can kind of do autocomplete to figure out the API without having to, go through all these different endpoints. It all comes through this one endpoint. All right, so far you're probably like, this is the best thing since sliced bread. And you're like, this is like awesome. And it is pretty cool. It pretty much is like that. But there are some drawbacks. And so you're not going to probably kill all of your APIs just for this one thing. There's still actually scenarios where you still need a REST API, and it's very hard to use GraphQL. So let's go over a few of those. So first of all, it's harder to cache. So you can see my query up here in the URL. My query is this big long thing, right? It's all this text. So you can put that in a URL and you can do a GET request, but most of the time you're usually doing a POST request. And it's very dependent, right? Normally you cache URLs based on the name or the, whatever the URL is. So if I were to take this, right, and put it in a different order, now my URL is going to be cached differently. So that can be a problem, especially when you get into using this on your front end. A lot of these queries you're not going to write by hand. You're going to have some kind of front end code that just generates them. So it might not necessarily come out in the same order, and you really want to cache stuff that's asking for the same data. So there's ways to get around this, but it's pretty much like a pain in the butt if you just want to cache some data with a simple URL.
So how does it work out for your pipeline?
I guess I can show that. So one of the things I wanted to do for the app was make it so that it was available offline. And one of the things is, right, I have to download all this information now offline. And so ideally, I would just one little URL, and then I can download it, that particular book, right? So ideally, let's see here, I want one data file that I can just download, and that I can cache. I can now cache the heck out of this on my server, right? Because it's never going to change. So that's hard to do. The ways around it that I've found is you can actually maybe write a special API endpoint, and so you can actually execute a query and kind of put that at a special URL. And so that's what I did. Basically, I manually wrote that query on the back end and put that at a special URL that will give me all that data at once. But I had to kind of set that up, right? So if you have lots of APIs that just need to be cached, this is not the best tool for that, because it's just going to get annoying, because then you're going to be making custom endpoints anyway. So you might as well just use a regular API for that. For me, I only kind of needed one, so it wasn't too annoying. Like I said, there's ways to get around this. If you're using an ORM, like with Django or Flask ORM, you could potentially cache your database layer. So when it goes and asks for it that way, you cache that. So you could cache at different points. and do it that way. But again, it kind of just gets a little annoying. A few other drawbacks. So this, like I said, this is only actually like 2 years old, and that's the JavaScript implementation. The Python implementation is actually even younger than that. So it's a new project. It doesn't have, I haven't run into any bugs per se, but good chance there's going to be some bugs in it. It also doesn't have some features that you may or may not want. So like, I just showed like a public API. There's really no built-in way to do authentication. You can do it, but maybe not like the prettiest as it will be. Hopefully here in the future will be a little bit better story for that.
I saw that your GitHub demo had a login, right?
Yep.
That was your login.
Yes, it was. Yep.
So basically, does that mean that you have to identify yourself on the HTTPS?
So the authentication, maybe I should take that back. Authentication is easy. It's maybe limiting your APIs based on the user. So one user you want to send this data back, and another user you want to send this. So you can do it, but I think probably like a year from now they'll probably have a better way and a more concise way of doing it. You can do that now, and I've done it, but it's maybe not the prettiest yet.
So if you want to export all data this way, or expose all the data that way?
Yeah, if you have a very public API, this is like perfect. So it's really great. Like I said, it might not have all the features you want. So when I started using it and trying it out, I actually made a contribution. So when I started using it, they didn't have a time field. So I was doing, times on my app, and I was like, shoot, I need to do this. So actually, that was my one little contribution so far back to the open source, and they accepted it. So there's now I forget, I think I just did the time field. Maybe I did the date time too, I forget now. It's been a couple months. But they had no time field, so now, if you're doing Django, you have a bunch of these fields in the ORM. Some of them won't work with this. So you may have to make a contribution into the project. It's a newer project. With that said, it was definitely cool to contribute to an open source project. So, but I had to tell that to my boss that I'm going to spend some extra time developing this API endpoint. So it doesn't have all the batteries included yet.
So if you have a given ORM for Django, right? How quickly can you expose that in your feed? I mean, how much code would you need?
So I'll show you. Basically what I showed you is what I did.
So it's like 4 lines per model. That's
So here's my Django models. So I have my models, and I would need these anyway. So this is code that I'm already going to write. And then, most of that stuff that I showed you on that slide, you're going to create a schema file. So most of that stuff that I showed you on that slide, so 25 lines of code, I've now exposed 2 models and made an API out of it. The only additional thing I had to add was you have to hook a URL up to it. So I hooked the URL. So you got to come in here and tell Django what you want your graphene URL to be. But basically, I had 2 models. I wanted to just expose them. It's all done in one little file.
What I like about your demo is that you get basically some kind of documentation right away with it.
Yes. Yep.
So you can basically view the contents, and you can also see what the
Yeah.
conditions are.
Yeah, and this, you get the docs with it, which is really nice, but also you get the kind of this interactive interface, so you can explore it and see what happens. So it's really nice.
So is there any way you can also attach more documentation to the fields?
I haven't played around with that yet, but so the question was, can you attach more documentation? I haven't played with that so much, but I did. There's other documentation generators, so I've used those to create like a. Sometimes it's kind of hard to go through this little sidebar thing, and so I've actually generated the docs in like a full site so that I could search for them easier.
Can't put a description up there like when you do your.
Yeah, I'm assuming you can fill these in. I just haven't.
Description, I think it's a line or something.
Yeah. So, but I haven't really explored adding more documentation to it. But I'm assuming there's some way to do that. Haven't.
Playing with maybe the front end, it's like Apollo or Relay pretty much.
I did. So the question was, have I played on the front end with this? And yes, I have. So there's different open source clients that interact with this, so you can just use them. Let's see. I think, yeah, so we went to the client libraries. So on your front end, where's the client libraries at?
Yeah, there's a bunch of them. The main two are basically Apollo.
Yeah.
And,
So,
Relay.
yeah, here we go. So Relay is one of the client libraries you can use to kind of generate stuff. Actually, I think Apollo uses Loca. So you're actually using both, I think.
It's native. It's their own.
Okay, maybe it's the other way around, but this was actually a dependency for one of them. With that said, I found them like really hard to work with and just like really a lot of bloat. So I just wanted like a simple query generator. I guess I should show off my own module here if I can find it. I made a little query generator. I called it Neutron Graph to just generate queries for me a little bit easier. Like I said, you know, normally the workflow is I come in here, I figure out what kind of data I want, and then you really could like copy and paste that. But I just want a little way to make this a little bit easier. So you can see I'm querying my verse node. I'm filtering by a book and a chapter, and then I'm telling it I want a text in the verse. So I made this little Neutron Graph library so that I could generate queries on the fly. And then also the cool little thing is you can just chain them together. So you can do like one query after another, and it'll chain them together all in one request and then bring you back all the data. So you can do, yeah, here we go. Here's the query chain. So I'm doing my first query, I'm doing my second one, and then I'm getting, so the get, I'm just getting a single item by ID, and then I'm submitting them and getting all the data back at once. So that was just a little library I wrote. I guess I should have put that in there. But yeah, the kind of default clients that come with GraphQL are like just big and bloated, and there's just a lot of stuff to learn, and it's really just a simple concept. So I ended up writing my own for that. Any other questions? All right, well, that's all I have. Yeah, another question?
I'm assuming that the main GraphQL is based around the graph data structure, because I assume you've got like edges and nodes and
Yeah, so yeah, the question was where does the name come from? And yeah, actually that's a really confusing thing because there's a lot of things called graph nowadays. So there's like graph databases. So people think that it's for like graph databases. I guess it could potentially be for that. Yeah, it's more for like a data graph. You're like creating a data graph of your data. So it's a query language for your data graph. And so actually, you can see my URLs. I usually always call it, put it at /data graph. That's how I think of it. But the name is actually really confusing because there's so many graph things nowadays.
talking about it today at work, and I came up with like, what is it? Is it for like some sort of GUI thing, or is it a
Yeah, yeah, it could be like for plotting things. No, it's not for like XY graphs.
Yeah, actually, I played with it throughout a lot of the Facebook videos. Since they wrote the spec, they'll tell you kind of a bad name because it's not built on a graph database. It's marketing.
Yeah, I think it's just because there's so many things called graph nowadays. Like,
Yeah.
it's like, what the heck is this?
Yeah, I was going to say too. I played with it a fair amount. And I've spent a fair amount of time with Apollo, and they do have a lot of them. The one thing you do get with them, if you do any single page apps, is like Apollo itself. I think, at least at this point, I didn't have to play much relay looking at both of them. I had to play more with Apollo. But if you do anything with React, they have a really nice. They have a basic client, but then they integrate with various frameworks. And so with React, it's a pretty natural extension of React. So if you do containers, it makes it really easy to extend a container and have your GraphQL query run in the same container or run the same file and go out and get your data. It's a really nice API. And then they also internally they use Redux as their data structure, which is pretty slick too. You can also hook your own if you're using Redux for all your data bindings. You can also hook into their Redux data container. You can use your own, and so they basically build this cache, which is pretty slick. So every time you go out and you build all your queries, and then their cache smartly will go out and actually batch those queries together. It'll sometimes the data updates a different part of your UI instead of one container going out and grabbing data from the API. It'll just grab it internally on the front end. So it's a lot of code. And then recently they've got a whole bunch of features. They've got easy ways to do pagination or easier ways to do pagination. But they just added a subscription to it too, so you can also do real-time subscriptions where they'll automatically upgrade to WebSockets. And you can have real-time dynamic data going through GraphQL on the backend. It's pretty slick.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So yeah, that's the reason I kind of also use my own library. Is I did my little app in Vue.
What's that?
I did my little app in Vue.
Yeah.
So where if I was using React, yeah, I would have had a lot better kind of easier use of it. And then again, back to the caching. So again, to kind of since the URLs are harder to cache, one of the other strategies I added in was to cache it. So if you don't have Chrome, if you have Chrome, this will actually download and work offline for you. But if you don't have Chrome, actually cache it in local storage. So I cache that way. That way I don't have to cache a URL. So I put a front end cache on. So, but now I have like 3 different ways I cache stuff, and so probably not the best thing, but it's not too bad since it's a small app. So more headache than I thought I was going to have using it. So any other questions?
In terms of speed, right? I mean, sometimes or is it okay?
So yeah, in terms of speed, you're going to have the same kind of problems you have like with a regular API. I haven't really optimized my queries in Django, but you would have to go in now if you want to optimize these queries and put in to make sure it's doing the joins correctly. So like when I did mine, that was just looking up the book and then looking up the verses. And so there was no join. I could go in now and add a few lines to my Django code so that it would use a join and come out faster. But I haven't optimized that because I don't normally use it that way. But yeah, you have the same problems. If someone decides that they're just going to take all your data, you'll need some like kind of limitations to make sure like your pagination has some kind of limitation. They could come in and just crash, or hopefully your request gets cut off. But same kind of database problems. If you don't optimize your queries, it's going to be slow. So, but there are ways to go in and make sure that's happening. So kind of the same pain points as a regular API in that sense. So any other questions? Yeah, so if you do use the app, that's the other cool thing. It's a progressive web app, so if you're on Chrome, it downloads everything, it works offline. And then if you're not on Chrome, it will still cache stuff through local storage. So once you hit a certain page, you never have to download it again. So I wanted to learn Vue, and I wanted to try out some more progressive web app stuff. So it was a cool little app to try that out on. And now my dad doesn't have to watch pole dancers while he's reading his Bible. So
I just like Vue.
I really like Vue a lot. Yeah, it's really nice. So I think it's like a good middle point between Angular and React. It kind of has like a sweet spot, I think. So any other questions, comments? All right. Well, thanks for coming.